April 24th, 1945, North Atlantic, east of the Grand Banks. A steel-grey ocean heaving under low cloud as the destroyer Escort, USS Frederick C. Davis, cuts through swells that slap the bow like wet concrete. The wind carries that sharp, cold taste of salt and diesel, and every few seconds, the hull shudders as sonar pings roll out into the dark water ahead, searching for a shape that refuses to be seen. In the Combat Information Center, red lights stain faces and clipboards. A young sonar operator listens with headphones pressed tight, eyes closed, as if he can force meaning out of static, while a radar plotter traces blips that appear and vanish in the clutter of weather. Outside, on the open bridge, the officer of the deck keeps glancing at the horizon, empty, hostile, and too wide, because the men have been told this isn't just another late-war submarine sweep. The rumor has a name, whispered like a curse. Rocket boats, German Type 9 U-boats that might be coming to the American coast with V-1 flying bombs, a last theatrical strike meant to prove the Reich can still reach across an ocean. That fear is what has driven the US Navy to launch Operation Teardrop, April into May 1945, assembling two massive barrier forces of escort carriers and destroyer escorts to intercept German submarines before they can slip past the patrol lines. The briefings have been blunt. A handful of U-boats, but the stakes are psychological as much as military. Do not let a single one leak through. The men aboard Davis do not know whether the missile threat is real. History will later show the submarines carried no V-1s, but in this moment the possibility is enough to make every sound feel like a countdown. Far below the surface, the enemy is fighting a different war than the one Americans imagine. Captain Lieutenant Paul Just of U-546 has been ordered west as part of the late war push that Allied codebreakers are already tracking. The sea is violent, the air patrols are relentless, and the best weapon he believes he has is not a deck gun or even torpedoes. It's invisibility. The snorkel, the snorkel, is a thin metal mast that lets the diesel engines breathe while the boat stays submerged, reducing the time the submarine must surface and expose itself to radar. In the claustrophobic control room, the air is oily and damp, condensation beads on pipes, and every man speaks in half voices because sound feels dangerous even though the ocean will swallow it. The snorkel head valve clacks with each slap of wave above, a mechanical heartbeat that tells them they're moving, still hidden, still alive. But hidden is a fragile word in 1945. The Americans have escort carriers somewhere beyond the horizon, and even when heavy seas make flight operations miserable, aircraft and surface escorts can still force a submarine to stay down, slow, and blind. On Davis, the captain's voice comes sharp over the internal phones. Maintain station, keep the line tight, no gaps, because Teardrop's barrier is a net, and a net only works if every ship holds. The sailors know the doctrine. Keep the sub submerged until it can't maneuver, then kill it with coordinated sonar and weapons like Hedgehog. Those spiked projectiles that arc forward and explode only on contact, turning the hunt into a brutal close-range geometry problem. The ship's crew has practiced this over and over in drills that felt routine, until now. Now each ping is a question with teeth. Is he there? Is he listening back? Then comes a contact. Uncertain, fleeting, enough to tighten throats, but not enough to fire. The sea state is bad, the sonar conditions unpredictable, and everyone knows a U-boat captain who believes in the snorkel believes he can slide under the storm like a thief under a coat. Somewhere ahead, Just is doing exactly that, creeping toward a line of American escorts, searching for one weak point, one moment of confusion. In his mind, the snorkel isn't just engineering, it's hope. The hope that the old rules of detection can be beaten long enough to land one decisive blow. But Teardrop is built to deny hope. Destroyer escorts spaced like pickets, escort carriers shepherding the area, and a relentless operational rhythm meant to exhaust a submarine's battery, patience, and luck. On the bridge of Davis, a lookout wipes spray from his binoculars and sees nothing. Below, the sonar operator hears something that might be propeller cavitation, or might be imagination. The CIC watch officer leans in, voice low. Mark it, track it, don't lose it. The ship angles slightly, a subtle change felt through the deck plates. Somewhere in the bow, men stand ready at the Hedgehog launcher, gloved hands on cold metal. And beneath the chaos of weather and machinery, another sound exists only in the mind. The phantom whine of an acoustic torpedo, the kind that hunts noise itself. U-546 carries those too, the T-5 Zaunkönig, and if just can get close enough, the escort's own screws could become its death sentence. Within hours, this barrier line will stop being an abstract map and become a knife fight at sea. A torpedo run at near point-blank range, a ship hit in the forward engine room, and men spilling into freezing water under a sky that refuses to care. The knife fight arrives with no warning siren, just a single shouted bearing in the Combat Information Center, and the sudden, sickening change in everyone's breathing as the destroyer escort USS Frederick C. Davis, DE-136, picks up a contact at close range on April 24, 1945, somewhere in the cold North Atlantic screen, guarding the escort carrier core, CVE-13, where the second barrier force is stretched thin across a sea that will not sit still. On Davis, the bridge is slick with spray. The officer of the deck grips the rail as the ship heels, and down below the sonar operator's pencil jitters over the tracing paper while he tries to hold a steady track through weather noise and prop wash. You can feel the tension in the ship's bones, the pings, the answered echoes, the brief moments of nothing, then a shape again, close enough to mean danger. Far beneath them, Kapitän Lieutenant Paul Just is doing what the Snorkel was meant to enable, staying low, staying patient, letting the Americans burn fuel in daylight while he inches toward the carrier screen. Inside U-546, the air is thick with diesel residue and sweat trapped in wool. The boat is a steel coffin packed with men who haven't seen the sun in days, and the snorkel mast above them is both lifeline and liability. Every wave slap makes the head valve chatter. Every change in depth risks a broach that could paint them onto radar. Just doesn't have the luxury of a perfect shot, not with destroyer escorts sweeping an aircraft somewhere beyond the murk. So he chooses the weapon that punishes escorts for doing their job, an acoustic homing torpedo, a noise seeker designed to listen for the thrum of screws and chase it like an animal. In the American CIC, someone calls out a new solution. On the bridge, the captain's voice hardens. Course change. Bring her around. Because the instinct is to turn into the attack, to present the narrowest target and close the range before the submarine can slip away. That decision happens in seconds. A human choice made on a rolling bridge with wind in your ears and salt in your eyes, and it is the last maneuver Davis will ever complete. U-546 fires from the stern, one torpedo, and the ocean between them becomes a short hallway with a bullet in it. The escort turns into the threat, but the torpedo finds its mark anyway, detonating with a flash that is more felt than seen, a deep concussion that seems to lift the ship from underneath. Metal screams, the hull tears, the deck bucks as if it's been punched by something alive, and men who are running to stations are suddenly airborne, slammed into bulkheads, thrown against ladders. The forward spaces fill with smoke and steam, and the ship begins to break in two, sinking in minutes, so fast that training becomes panic management, so fast that some never reach topside. A lookout who was staring into the grey horizon now sees the impossible. His own ship dying, the Atlantic swallowing steel, oil blooming across the surface like ink. In the water, the cold is an immediate violence. It steals breath, clamps muscles, turns a man's arms into dead weight, and the sea does not care that the war is almost over. Sailors cling to wreckage, to life rafts, to each other, their voices thin in the wind, some shouting names, some praying, some just making noise so they don't disappear quietly. Nearby, other destroyer escorts race in, and the rescue begins under the shadow of another danger. The U-boat that fired may still be close enough to fire again, and the escorts must choose: save the men in the water or kill the submarine before it kills more. Flaherty, DE-135, starts pulling survivors from the freezing sea, while Pillsbury, DE-133, circles, and the hunt forms almost automatically, like a reflex. Sonar teams recenter, attack plots are drawn, and within less than an hour, Flaherty makes contact and turns from rescue to pursuit. Down below, U-546 drops deep, around 600 feet, trying to let the chaos above blur into safety, but Teardrop's whole purpose is to deny the submarine that kind of escape. For the next hours, the ocean becomes a contained battlefield of pings and patterns. Contact lost, contact regained. Varian, DE-798, Janssen, DE-396, and Hubbard, DE-211, join the attacks. A creeping approach is coordinated with Chatelaine, DE-149, directing, each ship taking turns pressing the U-boat, forcing it to maneuver, draining battery and nerve. Above the surface, the weather stays ugly, but the barrier line expands and sweeps anyway. Because if just slips through, every rumor about rocket boats in American cities becomes a headline, and the Navy will have failed in the one place it cannot afford failure. Late in the day, after nearly 12 hours of pressure, Varian makes contact again at 17:31. Orders snap across radios, and Flaherty is vectored in for another attack. At 18:10, she fires. 4 minutes later, a small oil slick begins to rise, the sea itself betraying the submarine's wounds. Then at 18:28, Flaherty launches Hedgehog, those forward-thrown spines that either strike and explode or do nothing at all. And 10 minutes after that, at 18:38, the U-boat breaks the surface, forced up like a hunted animal finally out of air. Every ship within range opens fire. Muzzle flashes stab the dusk, tracers stitch the conning tower, and men who have been listening to the enemy all day finally see him. At 18:44, U-546 rolls under and sinks at 43 degrees 53 minutes north, 40 degrees 7 minutes west, south-southeast of Cape Farewell, Greenland, ending the last combat sinking and countersinking drama between a German U-boat and a US Navy warship in the Atlantic. And as the gun smoke thins, the escorts turn again, back to the water, hauling German survivors into rafts and onto decks, 33 of them rescued, shivering, stunned, and about to become the center of a question that has been driving Teardrop from the start. Were they really carrying the means to strike America? The first thing the German survivors feel is not defeat, but air, raw, cold Atlantic air that burns the lungs after hours in a steel hull. And then the sudden violence of hands grabbing wool and canvas as American sailors haul them over a destroyer escort's rail, boots skidding on a deck slick with spray and cordite. Kapitän Leutnant Paul Just is among them, coughing brine, his face grey with exhaustion, his eyes searching the horizon as if the submarine might still be there, still able to reverse the day. Around him, the US ships are already turning back into the wreckage field, because the ocean is now full of Americans too. Men from Frederick C. Davis, who went from general quarters to open water in minutes, and every officer on the screen has to make the same impossible calculation. The enemy has been neutralized, but the sea is still killing your people. The destroyer escort Hater takes over rescue duties after the torpedoing, ordered in while other escorts keep the hunt tight, and by the time she arrives, the surface is a nightmare of diesel sheen and floating debris, life rafts and nets, men clinging to planks with numb hands, some too shocked even to shout. Davis had been struck at 0840 and sank shortly after, and Hater's rescue begins at 0937 and runs until 1305, with sailors repeatedly stopping their ship in heavy seas, heaving lines out, dragging singles to the side, and in more than one case jumping overboard into rough water to reach men who can't move anymore. The water is 57 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to steal strength fast, and the survivors' conditions blur into a pattern the ship's medical officer will later describe as shock, chills, and acute anxiety. 1/3 can walk, 1/3 can't even undress from violent shivering, 1/3 are unconscious or semi-conscious, and 3 who are not breathing are brought back by artificial respiration on the wet deck while the wind tries to tear the blankets away. On the bridge, someone keeps counting, because counting is the only way to make chaos measurable. By afternoon, 77 men from Davis have been brought aboard Hater, some dead, some dying, most alive only because rescue is fast enough. And there's no time for ceremony, only triage. Warm blankets, dry clothes, coffee, brandy, plasma, for the worst cases, morphine for the pain, and something harder to dispense for the looks on faces that keep asking, without words, why this is happening when the war is supposed to be ending. Meanwhile, the German survivors are shivering under guard on another ship's deck, and the questions begin almost immediately. Not the polite questions of a prisoner register, but the urgent, almost frantic questions of a navy that has built Operation Teardrop around one fear: that a snorkel-equipped Type 9 has slipped toward the American coast with something more than torpedoes, something meant to terrify a civilian public that believes the ocean is a wall. Even as spray whips across faces, an American officer leans close to Paul Just and demands, in that clipped, controlled tone men use when they don't want their fear heard, "What are you carrying? Where are the rockets?" The words sound absurd against the reality of burned metal and freezing men. But the rumor has had a life of its own. German threats, intelligence hints, disinformation, enough to convince leaders that they cannot risk a V1 story becoming a New York headline. And that is why the barrier forces are out here at all. Escort carriers and destroyer escorts stretched across hundreds of miles, forcing submarines to stay submerged, slow, and hunted. Just can barely stand, but he understands the danger in the question. Not what it implies about weapons he does not have, but what it implies about what the Americans might do if they believe he's lying. He answers as a submarine captain answers: careful, precise, clipped, insisting there are no missiles, no V1s, only orders to attack shipping, only torpedoes and fuel and exhausted men. The interrogator's face doesn't change because certainty is rare in war, and Teardrop has been fueled by the idea that uncertainty itself can kill cities. As afternoon slides into evening, the operational machine keeps turning. Survivors are redistributed, ships reform patrol lines, and the escort carrier Bogue becomes a floating receiving station for the human wreckage of the day. Hater is ordered alongside in heavy seas and darkness to transfer the living and the dead between 2123 and 2259, using breeches buoys, the old rig swaying over black water like a pendulum, each man in the sling disappearing into the night for a moment before landing on the carrier's deck to a new set of hands and a new set of questions. Somewhere on that carrier, under bright lights that make every face look more haunted, an American intelligence officer opens a notebook, writes U-546, and prepares to ask again about rockets and launch gear and secret orders while Paul Just, salt-caked, bruised, alive, realizes the snorkel that was supposed to make him invisible has delivered him into a different kind of exposure, not to radar, but to men who believe the war can still reach their shores, unless he convinces them otherwise. April 27, 1945. Naval Operating Base Argentia, Newfoundland. The wind off Placentia Bay cuts through wool like it's paper, and when the German survivors of U-546 are marched down a pier under armed guard, the cold feels different from the Atlantic's open water cruelty. It's a hard, steady cold that lives in metal and concrete, in floodlit fences and damp barracks, in the kind of place built to keep men contained and information flowing in one direction. The first hours are almost procedural. Names, ranks, specialties. The same questions asked again with small changes, as if repetition itself might loosen a hidden detail. They have already been interviewed at sea after U-546 was forced to the surface and sunk, and now the Americans are still chasing the same fear that launched Operation Teardrop, snorkel-equipped Type 9 boats approaching the US coast, possibly with rocket capability, an anxiety later shown to be unfounded. But in late April 1945, it sits inside every question like a live charge. Under bright lights that turn everyone's face pale and severe, an intelligence officer studies the prisoners the way a mechanic studies a machine. Who among them is a radio man, who handled navigation, who understands special fittings, who might know anything about unusual deck structures or sealed containers? Then comes the sorting. Within hours of arrival, the group is screened, and 8 specialists are separated from the others. The remaining prisoners are moved on toward ordinary POW processing, but these 8 are kept back, placed into solitary confinement, and told, explicitly or by implication, that their comfort depends on their cooperation. Capitaine Lieutenant Paul Just, still salt-caked in the seams of his uniform, still carrying the exhaustion of a 12-hour chase and a sinking, watches the separation with a commander's dread. He knows what it means when the interrogators stop asking general questions and start pulling apart the men who can confirm or deny a technical rumor. The Americans call the next phase shock interrogation, a phrase that sounds clinical until you see what it does to bodies: sleep deprivation, exhausting physical exercise, and, according to later accounts and official recollections, beatings meant to break resistance fast before another U-boat might slip through the net. The rooms are plain, but the emptiness is the point. Without normal sounds, without a clock, without the relief of conversation, time becomes another weapon. A guard's boots on the corridor floor become a threat you can't measure. When Just is brought in again, he is made to stand, then made to sit, then made to stand again, the rhythm designed to deny him the simple stability of posture, to keep his mind chasing physical discomfort instead of organized thought. The questions keep circling back. How many boats are in Gruppe Seawolf? Where are they headed? What special equipment do they carry? What is the mission? The interrogators speak in a tone that tries to sound like patience, but the urgency leaks through, because to the US Navy, the idea of a German weapon striking New York or Boston, even in April 1945, is not just a military threat, but a political shock that cannot be allowed to happen. Just answers carefully at first, refusing what he can refuse, admitting what he thinks is already obvious. They were ordered west, they were ordered to attack, they were ordered to break Allied morale if they could. The snorkel, he insists, is not a magic cloak. It is a tool to stay submerged longer in a sky dominated by Allied patrol aircraft and radar. But the men across the table aren't satisfied with not a magic cloak, because Teardrop has taught them a snorkel already changes the old rules of detection. Even escort carrier air wings, frustrated by storms and poor visibility, have still been able to force U-boats down and slow them, turning speed into a liability and batteries into a countdown. Outside the interrogation rooms, the war continues to end. Headlines speak of Berlin's encirclement. Radios hint that Germany's collapse is imminent. Inside these rooms, none of that matters. Here, the war is reduced to whether a prisoner will say the right sentence, yes, missiles, or no, none. In that pressure cooker, something ugly happens, something that will later stain the operation's record. Accounts preserved by naval historians and summaries from the Navy's own retrospective writing describe prisoners being struck and driven to collapse, the coercion justified in the minds of interrogators by the possibility, however remote, of saving American cities from attack. On April 30th, after repeated sessions, Just finally gives a piece of what the Americans want. He provides brief information on Gruppe Seawolf's composition and mission, and in one account he collapses unconscious afterward, his body finally refusing to keep pace with the demands being placed on it. Yet even then, the central answer remains maddeningly absent. No mention of missile launching equipment, no confirmation of V-1 fittings, no technical details that would justify the fear that started this chase. The interrogators hear what he says, but they also hear what he does not say, and silence becomes suspicious. Orders come down for the specialist to be moved again. South, to an interrogation facility where secrecy is tighter and pressure can be sustained without outside eyes. The name will not be spoken to the prisoners, but it exists as a destination. Fort Hunt, Virginia, a place designed to strip men down to what they know. As the Germans are loaded onto transport, Just catches a glimpse of the grey bay through a doorway and realizes the snorkel that promised invisibility has led him into a kind of exposure far worse than radar. Because on the ocean, a captain can fight with depth and silence. But here, stripped of his boat and boxed in by concrete, the fight is against time, pain, and the fear that the Americans will keep escalating until they hear a story that matches the rumor, whether it is true or not. Early May 1945. Fort Hunt, Virginia. Quiet woods and the Potomac not far away. A place that looks too peaceful to be part of a war until you see the wire, the guard towers, the plain barracks, and the deliberate anonymity of its name. P.O. Box 1142. A secret U.S. military intelligence interrogation center where German prisoners, especially those with technical or operational value, are questioned out of sight, away from the Red Cross, away from the ordinary paperwork of captivity. The 8 specialists from U-546 arrive after days of transfers and closed-door handling that leave them disoriented. First the cold confinement at Argentia, then movement under escort, then the sudden switch from ocean wind to humid Virginia air that smells of pine and river mud. Capitaine Lieutenant Paul just steps off transport with the posture of a man trying to keep command of himself when command has already been taken away. He is not greeted by shouting or spectacle, only by efficiency, a guard's hand indicating where to stand, a clerk's pen scratching across forms, a medic's quick glance, then a march to a barracks, where the windows look ordinary, but do not feel ordinary because every sound is swallowed by the sense of being watched. The Americans who run this place are not the kind you picture from propaganda posters. Many are German-speaking, sharp-eyed, and culturally fluent, selected precisely because they can hear lies in the spaces between words, because they can mimic tone, offer a cigarette with one hand and a trap with the other. Just has survived depth charges and the brutal math of a destroyer escort screen. Now he has to survive something colder, psychological pressure designed to make a man talk even when his body is intact. Fort Hunt's methods are built on patience and control, isolation, routine disruption, the strategic use of helpful fellow prisoners, and, most important, listening. Microphones in walls, hidden devices near bunks, conversations recorded when a prisoner believes he is alone, the smallest throwaway comment treated like a cracked safe door. The irony is that a submariner trained to fear enemy detection, now lives inside a detection system he cannot see, and the men questioning him speak softly, as if volume would contaminate the evidence they're collecting. In a small room with a bare table, an interrogator opens with something almost courteous. Capitaine Lieutenant, the war is effectively finished. You can save lives by helping us end the last danger. The last danger, those words, are the ghost of Operation Teardrop itself, the fear that had turned the North Atlantic into a barrier line of escort carriers and destroyer escorts because U-boats were believed to be approaching the American coast and might be tied to German wonder weapon threats. Just recognizes the hook. It's a moral frame meant to push him into confession, and it comes wrapped in specific questions. Who remains of Gruppe Seawolf? Where are they ordered? What equipment do they carry? What is the real mission? The interrogator's pen moves only when Just gives something concrete. Names, dates, the outline of orders that the Americans likely already know from decrypted traffic, but want confirmed in a human voice. And yet the question that keeps returning is the one that has poisoned the air since April: missiles. Were you fitted for V1? Did you carry launch gear? Did any boat in your group have it? Just's answer stays stubbornly consistent, not because he is brave, but because it is true. U-546 was a Type 9C with torpedoes, guns, a snorkel, exhausted men, and a mission to attack shipping, not to fire rockets at cities. The frustration in the room is controlled. No slam fists, no shouting. Just the interrogator's sudden shift into another method, offering just a narrative and watching whether he steps into it. Germany threatened New York, the American says, as if reading from a file. Our fleet lost Frederick C. Davis because your acoustic torpedo ignored the Foxer. We will not lose a city because you withheld a detail. The name of the ship lands like a weight. Just sees again, in his mind, the moment he fired the T-5 at close range and the escort vanished into spray and smoke, an act of war that has now become a lever used against him. Outside Fort Hunt, the war is still moving in real time. Teardrop's barrier forces keep sliding southwest, still hunting the remaining U-boats, still forcing them to stay submerged and slow, and on May 5th, U-881 is detected attempting to pass under the line and is sunk by a destroyer escort's depth charges with no survivors, the last German submarine sunk by the US. Navy in the war. Inside Fort Hunt, that sinking becomes another pressure point, another reason the interrogators insist speed matters. If a boat can slip through even once, it becomes a national humiliation. Just is shown papers, asked to annotate them, asked to write the history of U-546 in his own hand, the kind of task that sounds harmless, until you realize it is also a way to extract operational detail without a direct question, a way to catch contradictions later. Accounts differ on how harsh the treatment remained after Argentia. Some official and institutional histories emphasize intelligence methods over physical coercion, while other scholarship and archival commentary describe the U-546 specialists as having been abused in the urgent search for missile confirmation. Yet in Just's lived reality, the common thread is the same. He is trapped in a system built to make him doubt the value of silence. At night, in the barracks, he lies awake listening to another prisoner's breathing, wondering if the man beside him is just another captured submariner, or an American plant trained to draw him out with the right complaint, the right shared bitterness, the right question asked casually in the dark. The Snorkel had promised invisibility at sea. Fort Hunt proves a crueler lesson. The moment you are captured, invisibility is no longer the goal. Exposure is, and they will peel it from you layer by layer until the rumor dies or becomes reality on paper. May 5th, 1945. North Atlantic, pre-dawn darkness, flat, black water under a low ceiling of cloud as the destroyer escort USS Farquhar holds station on the barrier line. Her wake a pale scar that vanishes behind her, her sonar pings marching ahead into the deep, like footsteps in a hallway. The men on watch are running on a strange mix of exhaustion and adrenaline because Operation Teardrop has reached that late war phase where every patrol feels pointless until it suddenly isn't, and the rumor that started it all, rocket U-boats, V1 threats, a final strike at the American coast, still hangs over the radio circuits like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. The sea has already taken one of their own, Frederick C. Davis, and that loss has hardened the barrier force into something grim and methodical. Keep the line tight, keep the U-boats down, deny them speed, deny them air, make their batteries and nerves run out before yours do. On Farquhar's bridge, the officer of the deck squints into the dark where nothing is visible. Below, the sonar operator is hunched forward with headphones clamped on, listening for a sound that doesn't belong to waves. A faint mechanical beat that might be screws, or might be a snorkel mast slicing the surface just enough to breathe. The contact comes as a steadying of the line on the plotting board, an echo that repeats, that holds its shape through the clutter. And for a few seconds, the ship feels like a predator that has finally gotten scent. Orders snap down. Come right, steady on course, prepare to drop. There's no dramatic music, just the heavy thud of depth charges being rolled into position, just the metallic clank of arming mechanisms, just the sudden quiet in voices as men focus on the distance between now and impact. Somewhere down there is U-881, one of the last submarines still attempting to pass submerged through the net, trying to crawl beneath the barrier line the way a thief tries to slide beneath a closing door, believing the ocean is still wide enough to hide in. On Farker, the helmsman holds the new heading as the bow rises and falls, and the ship's screws churn harder. Then the depth charges go over. 1, 2, a pattern, and the sea behind the ship becomes a boiling bruise as explosions hammer the water column, the concussion vibrating up through the hull and into teeth and bones. Men wait for the sound that follows a kill. Oil, debris, the absence of a contact that had been there a moment earlier. And when the sonar operator calls it, when the echo collapses into nothing and does not come back, the bridge feels an awful relief. Another boat down, no survivors, and with it, a hard truth that the last battle can still take lives, even when the war's end is visible on the calendar. The barrier force doesn't celebrate. It tightens up and keeps moving, because the ocean doesn't give certificates for being right. 2 days later, May 7th, a different kind of signal begins to spread through the fleet. Coded messages, clipped confirmations that the war in Europe is ending, that German forces are being ordered to stop fighting and surrender. On deck, sailors look at one another with faces that don't know whether to smile or stay suspicious. Because in anti-submarine warfare, you learn that the most dangerous moment can be the one when you believe it's over. The barrier line shifts again, establishing its final position along the 60th meridian, and now the same escorts that have been hunting are suddenly watching for a periscope not as a target, but as a surrendering guest. It is an unnatural transition, like switching from fists to handshakes mid-swing. Radio calls start coming in, German voices, strained and formal, requesting instructions, stating positions, claiming they will comply. And the Americans respond with a cold professionalism. Surface, fly a black flag, or make your deck visible, prepare to be boarded, no tricks. When a U-boat finally breaks the surface, it looks smaller than the fear that built Teardrop. Grey hull, water sheeting off the casing, the snorkel mast now nothing more than a pipe that can't hide anyone. And the boarding party approaches with weapons ready anyway, because the sea teaches you not to trust silhouettes. On one of those surrendered boats, the men stand in line as their captain speaks in a flat voice. They look like what they are by May 1945, starving technicians of a dying strategy, human beings who have been underwater too long, blinking in daylight like it's foreign. A young American sailor steps onto the deck and feels the strange quiet of stepping onto the enemy's home. He sees the torpedo tubes, the deck gun, the chipped paint, the salt-rusted fittings, and he realizes that if this boat had been carrying rockets, if it had been fitted for some last miracle weapon, the signs would have to exist in steel and hardware. Mounts, rails, cradles, something real enough to touch. But there is nothing like that, only the familiar anatomy of a U-boat and the exhausted eyes of the men who crewed it. Still, in Fort Hunt, hundreds of miles away, Kapitän Lieutenant Paul Just is not being asked to admire the anatomy of his submarine. He is being pressed to confirm a nightmare. The interrogators there hear about U-881's sinking, about the barrier holding, about surrender calls, and they use every new development as leverage. If Germany is collapsing, why protect secrets? If your comrades are surrendering, why not talk? If American sailors are still at risk, why delay the truth? Just sits in a room that smells of paper and stale smoke and tries to keep his answers consistent, because the only defense against a rumor is repetition. No missile fittings, no V-1 launch gear, no special rocket mission, only late war orders to disrupt shipping and morale, only snorkels and torpedoes and a captain's gamble that he could slip through a net that turned out to be tighter than he believed. The war's end does not end the pressure immediately. If anything, it sharpens it, because once surrender is official, there is less tolerance for ambiguity and less patience for silence. Days pass in measured routines, questions, notes, the careful presentation of maps and intercepted messages, the quiet suggestion that the Americans already know everything and are merely offering him the chance to be helpful. In that atmosphere, Just finally agrees to do what the interrogators want in a different form: to put the history of U-546 on paper, to write an account in his own hand, dates, movements, orders, weapons. Because a written narrative is easier to compare, easier to cross-check, easier to trap with. And as he writes, he can't escape the irony. The snorkel that was supposed to make him invisible at sea has made him a source on land, a piece of evidence in a fear-driven investigation that now must prove itself true, or admit it chased a phantom across the Atlantic. Outside, the surrendered U-boats are being taken under guard toward American ports, steel trophies and intelligence prizes, and the men of the barrier force watch them pass with faces that mix victory and bitterness, because their victory has names carved into it: Frederick C. Davis, the dead in the water, the last torpedo that hit when the end was near. And for Just, the realization comes in a quiet moment when his pen pauses over the page. Even if there were never any rockets, the hunt was real, the fear was real, and the cost was real. And that is what Operation Teardrop will become in memory: not just a last battle, but a final collision between technology, rumor, and the human urge to prevent a catastrophe at any price. May 12, 1945, Fort Hunt, Virginia, P.O. Box 1142, where the air smells of wet pine and old paper, and the war feels like it has been folded into filing cabinets. Capitaine Lieutenant Paul Just sits at a bare table under a hard light and finally does what the interrogators have been steering him toward since the North Atlantic swallowed his boat. He writes. The pen looks ordinary in his hand, but for a submariner, it is an instrument of surrender as real as any white flag, because every line he puts down, dates, headings, orders, equipment, is a rivet hammered into a record the Americans can cross-check against intercepts and reports and other prisoners' stories. Across from him, an intelligence officer does not hover like a bully. He sits like a clerk of the end of the war, patient, watchful, letting silence do the work, because Fort Hunt is built for this: strategic interrogation, controlled routine, the slow dismantling of resistance until a man tells you the truth simply to stop fighting shadows. Just has already been through the harsher chapter, Argentia, Newfoundland, where 8 specialists from U-546 were separated on April 27th and subjected to shock interrogation, exhausting exercise and beatings driven by one question that would not die. Were the submarines coming toward the American coast carrying missiles? He remembers the smell of that place, cold concrete and sweat, and he remembers collapsing unconscious on April 30th after giving brief details about Grupper Seawolf's composition and mission, not because he confessed a secret weapon, but because his body ran out before the Americans' fear did. Now the fear has a new shape. It is no longer the Atlantic itself, but an accusation hovering in every question, a narrative the interrogators keep offering him like a doorway. Germany threatened New York, therefore the U-boats must have been fitted for V1s, therefore you must know where the launch gear is. Just writes anyway, because writing is something he can control. The truth as he lived it, the cramped reality of a Type 9 boat trying to survive Allied radar and aircraft with a snorkel mast that let diesel engines breathe while staying submerged, the operational orders to attack shipping, the deadly moment on April 24th when U-546 was detected and he fired a T-5 acoustic torpedo at USS Frederick C. Davis from close range, and the escort sank in 5 minutes. 126 Americans gone, survivors hauled from 57-degree water within hours. He writes about that not to boast, but because he can feel the Americans' anger behind their professionalism. Men died late, when the end was near, and grief makes the human mind demand a reason big enough to justify it. Rockets, wonder weapons, something monstrous. when sometimes the reason is simply that war kills right up to the final second. In the days after VE Day, the outside world insists on closure. Germany's surrender, flags, headlines. But inside Fort Hunt, the work continues, because the US Navy cannot afford to let the missile rumor remain unanswered. The barrier forces that had stretched across the North Atlantic have already proved how real the fear was in steel and blood, and now the Navy needs proof one way or the other. The proof begins arriving at sea. On May 7th, as the second barrier force establishes a final line along the 60th meridian, German submarines begin surfacing not to attack, but to surrender. U-234, U-805, U-858, U-1228. Grey hulls rising from black water under American guns trained tight. Boarding parties stepping onto wet decks with weapons ready out of habit, even as the enemy stands with hands visible. One surrendered boat, U-858, will later be photographed and processed in detail. But in this moment, the significance is simpler. Surrendered crews can be questioned, compartments can be inspected, fittings can be examined by engineers who don't care about rumors, only hardware. The interrogations that follow are relentless but methodical. The crews of U-805 and U-858 confirm what just has been saying in different words. No missile launch equipment, no V-1 cradles, nothing fitted to fire rockets at cities. And yet the rumor refuses to die easily, because there had been real German experiments earlier in the war with rockets and submarines. And once an idea exists, especially one that terrifies, it echoes longer than facts. That echo leads to another ugly episode. Kapitän Leutnant Fritz Steinhoff, a U-boat officer linked to rocket trials and captured after U-873 surrendered, is subjected to abusive interrogation at Portsmouth by interviewers connected to the U-546 case. Soon after, he commits suicide at Charles Street Jail in Boston and the US. Navy launches an official investigation into the interrogation. In Fort Hunt, no one says we were wrong out loud. Institutions almost never do in real time. Instead, the questions subtly change from, "Where are the rockets?" to "How did this rumor start?" From hunting a weapon to tracing a fear. Just notices the shift the way a submariner notices a change in engine vibration. Small, but meaningful, because the interrogators begin asking less about launch gear and more about orders, communications, and the late war mindset. Why send Type 9 boats west at all? What did Berlin hope to gain? What did commanders tell their crews about the mission? And as he writes and rewrites his account, he cannot escape the final irony of Operation Teardrop. The threat that drove it, missile-armed U-boats, was ultimately not real in the way the Americans feared, yet the operation proved something else very real, something more unsettling, that coordinated hunter-killer tactics, communications intelligence, and the sheer industrial ability to put dozens of escorts and multiple escort carriers onto an ocean grid could strangle submarines even with snorkels, keep them submerged and slow, and kill them one by one until the Atlantic itself became a trap. Long after just sets down the pen, the Navy will even test its own version of the concept, adapting a V-1 derivative into the JB-2 Loon and launching it from US submarines beginning in 1947. Proof that the nightmare had been technically feasible, even if it was never carried out by the Germans in 1945. And that feasibility is what made the fear so potent. When the guard finally takes Just back to the barracks, the corridor is quiet, and for the first time since April, he senses the pressure easing. Not because he has revealed a secret weapon, but because the truth, boring and brutal, is finally winning. Snorkels did not make U-boats invisible, and rockets did not come. What came instead was the last Atlantic battle and the memory of men in cold water and an intelligence hunt that went too far because nobody wanted to be the officer who ignored a threat that might have been real. Mid-May 1945. Fort Hunt, Virginia. P.O. Box 1142. where the days are measured not by sunrise but by the scrape of a chair on a wooden floor and the soft click of a door that locks with the finality of a vault, Paul just begins to notice something that terrifies him more than shouting ever could. The interrogator's urgency is fading, not because they've grown kinder, but because the Atlantic is no longer producing new evidence to feed the nightmare. The war in Europe is over, the barrier forces are taking surrenders, and the simplest kind of truth, the kind that can be inspected with hands and flashlights, keeps arriving in the form of surfaced U-boats whose decks show no rails for V-1 launch, no hidden cradles, no strange fittings that would turn a Type 9 into a missile ship. The men who board them see torpedo hatches, deck guns, chipped paint, rusted fittings, the ordinary anatomy of submarines that have lived underwater too long, and the rocket story begins to die the way all bad rumors die, slowly, stubbornly, leaving bruises behind. In the interrogation room, the questions shift again, almost imperceptibly at first. Less, where are the missiles? More, who started the talk? Less, what is the launch gear? More, what were your orders precisely? Because once the immediate fear of an American city being struck fades, what remains is the Navy's need to justify why it threw 40-plus destroyer escorts and multiple escort carriers into the North Atlantic in the final weeks of the war, and why it lost the USS Frederick C. Davis anyway. Just feels that loss following him like a shadow. Every American who questions him knows the name of the ship, knows the hour, 0835, April 24th, knows that 126 men did not come home. And even if they speak politely, their eyes carry the question that no report can answer. Was it worth it? He cannot make it worth it. He can only describe what happened with the flat accuracy of a submariner. The contact, the sudden realization he'd been detected, the decision to fire a T5 acoustic torpedo, the brief, violent success, the 10-hour hunt that ended with hedgehog explosions and the forced surfacing of U-546, gunfire in the dusk, then water-filling steel and the shock of being dragged alive into the enemy's world. The Americans at Fort Hunt already know most of this. They have operational logs, after-action reports, sonar plots, and the relentless institutional memory of a Navy that writes everything down. What they need now is closure. Closure on the missile fear, and closure on the methods used to chase it. And that is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because you can sense it in the way the interrogator's tone tightens when they refer to Argentia without naming it, in the way a file is opened and a page turned with a certain carefulness, as if paper itself might cut. Just hears fragments from guards, from clerks who talk too much, from the thin grapevine that exists even in a place designed to isolate. A German U-boat officer, Friedrich Steinhoff, captured after U-873 surrendered, dead in a Boston jail cell on May 19, 1945. Wrist wounds, a rushed burial, and an official investigation in the wake of allegations of abusive interrogation. The rumor of missiles may be collapsing, but the rumor of brutality is now rising, and just understands the cruel symmetry. Fear created teardrop. Fear drove men to shock interrogation. And now fear of scandal threatens to stain an operation the Navy once remembered as vigilant and necessary. The interrogators do not confess anything to him, of course. They never would. They simply become more controlled, more procedural, as if the best defense is to sound like paperwork. They ask him to write again, more clearly, more systematically, because a written account feels safer than a broken man's verbal confession, and it will stand up later if someone asks why the Navy believed what it believed. Just writes, because writing is the only weapon left that doesn't rebound and strike him. He writes that U-546 carried torpedoes, not rockets, that the Snorkel was an adaptation to survive Allied air patrols and radar, not a cloak of invisibility, and he writes it in a way that sounds almost like an apology without actually being one. At night, when he is returned to the barracks, he lies awake and listens to the building itself. The small settling noises, the distant footsteps, the hush that seems unnatural because even silence here might be recorded. And he tries to understand how the Americans' idea of him changed. First a target, then a prisoner, then a suspected carrier of a phantom weapon, then finally a source, a man whose value is what he can confirm on paper. Somewhere far north, the ocean has already erased the physical evidence of his pride. U-546 is a grave, Davis is a grave, and the wreckage field is gone, but the men who lived through it are still moving through their own aftermath. American survivors who can still feel the cold of 2 to 4 hours in the water, German survivors who can still feel the moment the hatch opened and light hit faces that hadn't seen day in days. For the US Navy, the official aftermath is a stack of reports: teardrops tally, U-boats sunk, surrenders accepted, escort carriers and destroyer escorts deployed, and finally, the conclusion that missile launching equipment was never fitted to the German submarines targeted by the operation. But for Just, the personal aftermath is simpler and harder. He remembers believing the snorkel made him unseen, then learning that in 1945, nothing in the Atlantic is unseen for long. Not by radar, not by sonar, not by hunter-killer groups, and certainly not by an intelligence machine that can process thousands of prisoners and turn their smallest habits into reports. And as the summer approaches, with paperwork shifting him toward ordinary POW handling, he realizes the last trap Teardrop laid wasn't only out at sea, it was also in the mind, where the fear of a weapon that never arrived still managed to reshape decisions, justify violence, and leave a question hanging over the men who hunted and the men who were hunted. When you chase a phantom, how many real lives are you willing to spend to prove it, isn't there? Late May 1945. Norfolk, Virginia. Warm air over grey water, gulls circling above piers, and the strange sight of ships returning from a hunt that never made the front page the way Normandy did, yet still left bodies on the ocean floor. Escort carriers and destroyer escorts slide in under tugs, paint scuffed, rails salted white, decks stained by weeks of spray and fuel, and you can tell who has been to sea in anger because they move differently when they step onto land, as if their legs are still compensating for roll that isn't there. On the pier, there are no bands, no confetti, no victory speeches that fit, because the men coming back from Teardrop have one name in their throats: Frederick C. Davis, and one memory that keeps replaying: a torpedo hit in the late hours of the war, the ship breaking fast, the water so cold it felt like it had teeth. Word has already spread through the fleet that the barrier line held, that the last boats were sunk or surrendered, that there were no missiles, no V-1 launch rails, no rocket strike on American cities. So the question becomes not did you stop it, but what did it cost? And cost is the one thing no victory bulletin can soften. In a Navy office near the waterfront, a clerk slides a stack of typed pages across a desk: after-action reports, survivor statements, medical notes from rescue ships, each sheet trying to force chaos into a clean timeline. The moment the torpedo hit, the moment the ship went under, the hours in the water, the names of the men who didn't make it. A commander reads it with a pencil in hand, making small marks, and you can see in his face that he isn't just reconstructing a battle, he's building a document that will have to make sense to families, to Congress, to the Navy itself. Nearby, in a plain building where the air is stale and smells faintly of tobacco, Paul Just sits at another table, no longer under the hard, urgent pressure of the first weeks, but still trapped in a system that reduces a man to what he can provide: a name, a rank, a list, a written narrative. The interrogators now speak like men closing a file rather than men hunting a threat, and the difference is subtle but sharp. Less insistence, more verification, more of that quiet satisfaction institutions feel when the evidence aligns with what they can admit publicly. They ask him again, almost out of habit, about rockets, about secret fittings, about whether Berlin ever told him he was part of something special, and he answers the same way he has answered for weeks. No, there were threats and rumors and late-war desperation, but his boat carried torpedoes and a snorkel, and the ordinary misery of a Type 9 crew pushed west because someone in a collapsing command structure still wanted to strike. The interrogator's pen pauses, then scratches a final note. The missile fear is dying in ink, and ink is how wars are remembered. Just is moved again, this time without secrecy. The humiliating ordinariness of POW processing. Fingerprints, photographs, personal items catalogued, the slow drift toward a camp routine where the world is fenced and time is heavy. On the way, he passes an open window and hears a radio playing a cheerful American tune, and the normalcy hits him like a physical blow because it makes the Atlantic feel like a nightmare no one else can fully understand. In another part of the base, American sailors from the Teardrop screen clean gear and turn in equipment, their conversations tight and low. Some talk about the surrendered U-boats and how small they looked on the surface, how the snorkel mast that seemed like an invisibility wand was just a pipe once you could see it. Others don't talk at all, staring at nothing, hands working automatically. Scrub, fold, stow, because routine is safer than memory. A bosun's mate who helped haul men out of the water keeps replaying the feel of a frozen hand slipping through his glove, the weightlessness of a body that's already gone, and he can't make those sensations fit into the word victory, even though the war is officially ended. The Pacific is still fighting, yes, but the Atlantic, his Atlantic, has already delivered its last cruel lesson. The end of war doesn't arrive like a curtain drop. It arrives with scattered moments of violence that keep going after the audience thinks the show is over. In officers higher up the chain, the Navy's leadership is also dealing with another file, one that makes men speak even more carefully. Complaints and investigations surrounding how information was extracted during the missile scare, the knowledge that fear can make professionals do things they would condemn in calmer hours. The tone of memos shifts toward defensiveness, toward justification, toward the bureaucratic language of necessity, and you can feel the institution trying to protect both its reputation and its conscience, which don't always align. For Just, the institutional struggle is distant but not irrelevant, because he understands too late that the rumor he couldn't disprove fast enough made him valuable in a dangerous way. It made him a container for America's worst-case scenario, and once a man becomes that, he is no longer treated as merely an enemy combatant. He is treated as a key to a lock the Americans are terrified might exist. Days pass, and summer sunlight turns the base bright and ordinary. The ships that hunted in grey seas now sit alongside, quiet and still, and the contrast feels obscene to men who remember the Atlantic's violence. A chaplain stands with a small group on a pier and reads names, the wind tugging at pages, and in that moment the story of Operation Teardrop becomes something less strategic and more human. A set of choices made under uncertainty, a net thrown across an ocean, a captain who believed a snorkel could hide him, and sailors who learned that technology has no mercy, only consequences. Just hears about none of this directly, but he senses the war's last ripples every time a guard's posture changes, every time the questions stop being urgent and start being archival. And he realizes with a cold clarity that the final phase of defeat is not the sinking of your boat. It is becoming a paragraph in someone else's record. Your intentions reduced to a note, your pride reduced to a line item, your invisibility proven false by the simple fact that the winners get to write what happened next. June 1945. A humid morning in Virginia, the kind that makes shirts cling and turns every breath into warm cloth, and Paul Just is woken before dawn by the same sound that has defined his captivity more than any shouted threat, the rattle of keys and the measured cadence of boots in a corridor. Because today is another movement day, another transfer that feels ordinary to the Americans and strangely final to him. He dresses in silence, smoothing a uniform that no longer carries authority. And when the guard gestures him forward, he steps out into early light that smells of cut grass and diesel exhaust, the scent of an America untouched by bombs. And that contrast is its own kind of defeat. The truck ride is short, but it takes him past glimpses of everyday life that feel unreal after months of steel and salt. Men in work clothes crossing a yard with toolboxes, a clerk smoking outside an office, an American flag hanging limp in the still air. And he keeps thinking of the Atlantic, of the moment he believed the snorkel made him a ghost, of the control room darkness, the head valve clacking like a mechanical heartbeat, and then the sudden violence of detection, torpedo, sinking, pursuit, surfacing, and finally the rail of an American ship under his hands as he was hauled into the world he'd been trained to avoid. Now the fear that made him valuable is fading into administrative certainty. The rocket file is closing because surrendering boats have been inspected and their crews questioned. Because nothing has appeared in steel and fittings to justify the nightmare. Because the war has moved on to occupation maps and repatriation lists. And the interrogators who once pressed him like a man holding a knife now speak to him like a man closing a drawer. At the processing point, he is photographed again, fingerprinted again, his personal items catalogued with the indifferent precision of bureaucracy. He signs papers he cannot fully read, and each signature feels like another bolt tightened on a door that won't open back onto the sea. He is placed among other German prisoners, ordinary now, not specialists, men who talk too loudly, men who stare too long, men who speak of home as if the word itself can reverse time, and in their eyes he sees the same thing he has tried not to show. Relief at being alive, braided tightly with dread of what being alive now means. Somewhere in a separate, brighter world, the American sailors of Teardrop are also being processed, paid, transferred, sent on leave, assigned to new ships or to civilian life. And in mess halls and train stations, the same story keeps surfacing in fragments. A torpedo hit when the end was near, the shock of cold water, the frantic haul of survivors, the empty bunks afterward. Some men tell it with anger, some with awe at how quickly a ship can disappear, some with silence because speaking makes the memory too sharp. On a pier in Norfolk, a small group stands with a chaplain again, and the chaplain reads names into summer air that doesn't feel like war, and the words fall into the water as if the sea itself is the only witness who can carry them properly. A boatswain's mate closes his eyes and sees a face he pulled from the Atlantic, eyes open and unfocused, and he realizes the hunt that began as fear of rockets has ended as something else entirely. A lesson about the cost of certainty when certainty is impossible. In an office with fans turning slowly, a senior officer signs off on a report that will become the Navy's memory of the operation. Barrier forces deployed, U-boats sunk, surrenders accepted, the conclusion that missile launching fears were not borne out, and the ink dries with a sense of institutional relief. But the relief is not clean. There are other papers, other memos, the uncomfortable language of investigations and methods. The shadow of a scandal that refuses to vanish as neatly as the rumor, because even when a phantom threat is disproven, the actions taken in its pursuit remain real. Just does not see those memos, but he feels their aftertaste in the way his handlers avoid certain topics, in the way questions are now asked for the record rather than for salvation. He understands, in a way that is almost clinical, that war creates its own logic and then punishes the people who believed it too completely. In the POW camp, under open sky and wire, he finds a routine that feels like a parody of naval discipline. Roll calls, work details, thin coffee, letters that come late and read like they belong to another life. And at night, lying on a bunk, he listens to the ordinary chorus of a camp. Distant coughs, murmured German, an American guard's radio faint somewhere beyond the fence, and he thinks about invisibility again, but differently. He thinks about how the snorkel was supposed to hide a submarine from aircraft and radar, yet it also changed how a crew lived, forcing them into longer submerged stretches where fatigue and carbon dioxide and mechanical failure could turn a boat into a coffin, even without an enemy present. He thinks about the US escort carriers he never saw clearly, the destroyer escorts whose sonar pings were like footsteps in the deep, the hedgehog spines that made the ocean itself feel armed, and he realizes the terrible simplicity of what happened. The Americans built a net dense enough to make invisible boats crawl, and once a boat is forced to crawl, it can be killed. That is the real end of the story, not rockets and not rumors. The end is the demonstration of power. Industrial, tactical, technological, and organizational, the ability to put steel and men and aircraft into an ocean grid and keep them there until the hunted run out of air and options. And yet, for the men who lived it, the memory doesn't arrange itself as doctrine. It arranges itself as moments. The sound of the torpedo hit, the sting of salt in eyes, the feel of a rope cutting wet hands, the weight of a body pulled over a rail, the silence afterward, the knowledge that the war can still take a ship even when surrender is days away. One evening, as summer light fades and the camp grows quiet, just sits with another former submariner who asks, softly, almost like a confession, whether the snorkel ever truly made them safe. Just looks at the fence line, at the guard tower silhouetted against the sky, and answers, with the only truth left that doesn't need persuasion. It didn't make them invisible. It only delayed the moment they were seen. And in that delay, days, hours, minutes, men died on both sides. A ship sank, a rumor swelled, an interrogation crossed lines, and an operation meant to prevent a catastrophe became, in the end, a final Atlantic tragedy that proved how thin the boundary is between a real threat and the fear of one when the stakes are national.